How's it going, guys? I am S.E.5a, your local brick build historian, with another episode of Brick Build History. Today we're taking a look at the famous World War I British aircraft, the S.E.5a, brought to you by Brickmania. This is probably one of the more popular aircraft of World War I during the time of World War I. Kind of forgotten today because everyone thinks of the Camel whenever you think of World War I Allied aircraft. So this thing kind of lost out to the Camel in popularity, but for its immense ability of being stable and just overall amazing, really good. But without further ado, let's go into the review and then into the history, because there is a lot of history for this thing. Of course, as always, I always start off with the box. So you have S.E.5a, World War I fighter aircraft, serial number C1904, contains 445 Lego, Brick Arm, and Brickmania elements with a custom minifigure. Original design by Daniel Siskin. You have the manufacturing plate here on the top. Same information, BKM 457, skill level 3 out of 5. And I have kit number 9, so within the top 10. Then you have a monochromatic image on the back with a forward view. And here's the kit. The SE5 is a very weird plane. It's very boxy in the front. It kind of looks like a tractor, like the front end of a tractor. You have a 2-bladed propeller. Some models had 4 blades, but this one is a 2-bladed propeller. You have the grills for the radiator in the front here that are printed on, which is nice. Almost forgot to mention the printed props on the prop. You have the engine cylinders poking out here on both sides with the exhaust going down the back. You have a Vickers 303 machine gun mounted here. You have the gun sight mounted, which is just a tube. You have the really nice struts. I like how thin these struts are. Very proper looking is what I'm trying to think of. You have a Lewis gun on the top. You have these printed roundels on the top. This Z or Z sticker. Stickers on the bottom. These are printed, and so is the hexagon is printed. And then the sticker, which is a typo, the 0 and the 9 got switched. So, oh well, you know, accidents like that happen. You have a printed instrument panel on the inside the cockpit there with a glass windshield. You have Billy Bishop, a famous Canadian ace, sitting in the cockpit. And everything else is just World War I looking. You have working ailerons on both the top and the bottom wing, but they only go down. Really the only complaint is that the wheels don't like to spin. They kind of just stay where they are. But most of the time I swoosh it around like this, so you know, it's not really that big of a deal. Overall, you look at it and you see, oh, that's an S.E.5a, and there's really no way of misinterpreting it either. Some of the interesting techniques I found was getting this dihedral on this top wing, using these like that connection right there. Never would have ever thought of that myself. You have like the asymmetric connections for the struts here, because you have these pieces here and you use this cut tubing on this side, and then on this side it's completely different, probably to allow that Vickers to be mounted here. But it's kind of interesting. You have asymmetric connections right there which you don't really see often. But, you know, for their first try making an SE5, Dan did a really, really good job. But from there, let's go into the history. So the Royal Aircraft Factory's Scout Experimental 5, which is where the name SE5 comes from, was developed by Henry Folland, John Kenworthy, and Major Frank Gooden. And these three guys, Folland and Kenworthy being the designers, and Gooden being the main test pilot, would start making this thing in mid to late 1916. But it wouldn't be introduced until 1917. And it wouldn't actually go into full production really until 1918. And the reason for that is because of the engine. This thing, unlike many other Allied fighters, would use a S.E.5a V8 engine, meaning that it's got the cylinders are in a V. There's 8 cylinders, and it's in, like, you know, it's right here, but it's liquid cooled and quite heavy, unlike the radial engines or rotary engines of, like, say, the Camel and the Newport. Unfortunately, the S.E.5a was not only being used for the SE5, it was also used in aircraft like the Spads. So obtaining engines was kind of difficult, which is the reason that production was extremely slow in the beginning. But the S.E.5a 8 was 150 horsepower, and it was a direct crank to prop engine. They would eventually go into the S.E.5a 8B, which actually used a gearbox. So instead of the crank going straight to the prop, the crank would go to a gearbox, and then the gearbox would be ratioed so that the propeller would go faster and produce more power. Unfortunately, there was a big problem, and that was the fact that the gearbox would randomly fall out in flight, which is not good in a dogfight at all. So sometimes you might be able to catch this plane flying, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, that goes flying out, and then they just glide down to the ground. Although that would be fixed whenever the British started using their own licensed production of the S.E.5a, known as the Wolseley Viper. It was 200 horsepower, and it just basically fixed the issue. It was kind of a better version of the S.E.5a, which is kind of weird to think that a licensed production copy is better than the original. The SE5 is kind of known as a tuner plane. You can see an entire squadron of SE5s, and each one of them would be different somehow. The most common modification is this exhaust. You chop it off like here, so that the exhaust only is right there, and you don't have to deal with the extra weight, and it also provides slightly extra thrust. If you don't know, the exhaust actually provides some form of thrust for these aircraft. But chopping off the exhaust was a main thing that was done. There's this thing called the greenhouse, which was like kind of wrapped around the cockpit, and they would replace it with this small windscreen that is seen here. A lot of times the seats would be lowered because you're really high up in this aircraft, so they would lower the seat down. The headrest a lot of times would be removed. I know Albert Ball did that with his. James McCudden, if you don't know who James McCudden is, he was one of the highest scoring British aces at the end of the war. He would overcompress his pistons and get an extra 9 miles per hour from it. He would also do what's called the it was like the high altitude patrol, but basically he would be so high up that he would actually start experiencing hypoxia, and one of the greatest Allied aces of all time. The S.E.5, even though it was introduced before the Camel, would actually not be fully into service until after the Camel, and the Camel was kind of like the polar opposite of the S.E.5. They're roughly the same speed. The S.E.5 would go 138 miles per hour. I don't remember the speed of the Camel, but the S.E.5 was fast, slightly maneuverable. Basically, every other aircraft could outturn it, which is where the Camel is best at, is outturning aircraft in a dogfight. But the Camel was difficult to fly, while the S.E.5, you could literally have as much experience as me, which is like maybe 2 hours flying an aircraft, a real aircraft, and be able to fly it like perfectly fine. Really, in order to like put this thing down into a spin, you have to try, and part of that is attributed to these big wings. If you look at it, the S.E.5 compared to, say, the Camel, which I have over here, the S.E.5's wings are slightly wider, especially compared to the fuselage. Now, the S.E.5's fuselage is also slightly narrow, which is the reason why the single Vickers is on the side. And then you have the Lewis machine gun on the top. Now, the Lewis machine gun would be on what's called a Foster mount. So, move this Camel out of the way. So this Foster mount was basically a rail that would go from the top here down towards the pilot. This would not only allow the pilot to change the drum on the Lewis, but he can also point the gun straight up and fire it. Then he can also put it back down so that he can fire it forward. And then he has two triggers, one for the Vickers, one for the Lewis. A lot of British pilots would come to love and get quite a few kills in these. Billy Bishop, who's technically Canadian and represented here, would get a lot of kills, even though they're disputed. But he was the top Canadian ace, and unfortunately Canada brought him back before the end of the war because they didn't want to lose him. James McCudden and Edward Manick would also be quite renowned aces through the S.E.5, and it was just one of those planes that was just really stable, really good, known as the most stable gun platform of World War I. One pilot who didn't like it that much was Albert Ball, and Albert Ball would prefer his Newport 17 over the S.E.5, but whenever his Newport 17 was damaged, he had to take his S.E.5, and it was like his second mission in an S.E.5, and he was shot down by Lothar von Richthofen. There's a bit of debate between that, but oh well. The S.E.5 would end the war as being one of the most produced. 5,205 S.E.5s would be built in both the S.E.5 and the S.E.5a version. The main difference is the engine between going from a Hispano-Suiza 8 to an 8B or a Rollersley Viper. There was an S.E.5b that was produced with a streamlined nose. Basically, they put a nose cone over the propeller, but it never went into production because the war was basically coming to an end. And after the war, the S.E.5 would become quite obsolete due to the fact that all metal aircraft were starting to become popular. I think 1922 is whenever this officially was taken out of service, but they would still use it for like training and all that other good stuff. So, it had a pretty good life, especially for a time where by the time a aircraft was released, it was basically obsolete. The post, like, 1960s, 70s nickname given to the S.E.5 would be the Spitfire of World War I, because it was a British design that was extremely well-rounded. It was fast, maneuverable. You could upgrade it, you could tune it, you could do whatever you want to it, and it still just worked. So, you know, the S.E.5 has quite the reputation behind it for a very good reason. And, you know, without a doubt, the S.E.5, along with its Sopwith Camel brother, would end the war as being basically the two big British planes to just dominate World War I. You know, the Camel with its extra maneuverability but difficulty flying, compared to the easy flying S.E.5, but you give up some maneuverability. So it's kind of a give and take between these two, but whenever you have them together, they complement each other so well. And the British basically knew that, so that's what they decided to go with. Well, hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you learned something, go ahead and tell me in the comments. Tell me what you want me to do a review on next. And make sure you subscribe if you liked the video. Hit a like. Tell your friends about it. And hopefully sometime, whenever this COVID stuff is done, I can go into the Museum of Flight in Seattle and maybe show off an S.E.5 next to an S.E.5. I watched the Curator on the Loose video over it, and Matthew Brichette is a excellent curator who has a lot of knowledge, and hopefully one day I can be able to go there and, you know, just really see how close this is to the real thing. So, you know, there's this and a lot of other aircraft I would like to bring and do that. So, yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed. I have been Folkerman, and let's continue to build history.